Welcome to Fresh Ground Theology's The Weekend Cup. Order yourself a fresh cup of coffee, pull up a chair, and join us as we explore some of the most fascinating saints and figures from church history. For nearly half a century, Drogo lived within a small cell attached to the church at Sebourg. He had entered as a suffering man, his body disfigured by illness and his wandering brought to an end by a severe hernia. He remained through changing seasons, passing generations, and even a fire that consumed much of the church around him. Then, on the 16th of April, probably in the year 1186, Drogo died. He had spent his youth as an orphan in Epinay, his early adulthood as a shepherd in Sebourg, and many restless years walking the roads to Rome. Finally, he had given up the road altogether, surrendering himself to a life of prayer behind a wall. Now, the people of Sebourg prepared to bury the man who had become part of their village, but Drogo's surviving relatives had other plans. They came from Epinay, the place of his birth, and claimed his body for burial. By the customs of the time, theirs was a reasonable request. Drogo had been born among them. His family history belonged to their community, and perhaps they believed that his body should rest alongside those of his ancestors. The people of Sebourg reluctantly agreed. Drogo's remains were placed in a coffin, and the coffin was loaded onto an ox-drawn cart. The procession then began moving away from the church and toward the road that would carry him back to Epinay. At first, the ox pulled the cart forward. Then, the load seemed to become heavier. The animals strained against their harnesses. The cart slowed. The men guiding it urged the oxen forward, but every step seemed more difficult than the last. Finally, at the boundary of Sebourg, the cart stopped completely. The oxen could not move it another inch. Perhaps someone checked the wheels. Perhaps others added their own strength, pushing from behind or pulling beside the animals. Whatever they attempted, the cart would go no further. The people interpreted it as a sign. Drogo would not leave Sebourg. He had come to the village as a young stranger looking for work. Sebourg had given him sheep to tend, a church to worship at, and eventually a small chamber in which to spend the remainder of his life. Now, even in death, he seemed to have chosen it as his home. The procession turned around. Drogo's body was carried back to the village and buried within the church at Sebourg. At the place where the ox cart had stopped, the villagers erected a cross. The original cross has been replaced over the centuries, but the location continues to be remembered. The man who could not be carried beyond the village boundaries soon began drawing others towards it. Reports of healing spread to the surrounding countryside. Sick pilgrims came to Drogo's tomb, asking for his prayers and hoping for relief. The medieval chronicler Jacques Segui's, writing generations later, reported of miracles becoming so numerous and the crowd so great that it was sometimes difficult to even approach Drogo's resting place. The surviving accounts do not provide us with a careful catalog of every person, illness, prayer, and recovery, but Drogo's holiness took deep root among the people of northern France and Flanders. They had known him first as a shepherd, then they had known him as a pilgrim. Finally, they had known him as the hidden man beside the church, the quiet voice through a window who listened to their troubles, offered counsel, and prayed for them. After his death, they continued to believe that Drogo belonged to the communion of Christians gathered in the presence of God. In Catholic understanding, asking for his intercession was not treating Drogo as a replacement for Christ. It was asking a member of Christ's church to join his prayers with theirs. Protestants and Catholics do not always describe that practice in the same way, but Christians from both traditions can recognize that those villagers saw in Drogo a life that, however unusual and imperfect, bore witness to endurance, charity, and devotion to Christ. Drogo became a saint by vox populi, the voice of the people. He lived before the centralized canonization process used by the Roman Catholic Church. His reputation for holiness arose locally and continued for centuries until it received more formal recognition. His name was eventually included in the Roman martyrology, and in the early 17th century, the Archbishop of Cambrai formally elevated his relics at Sebourg. By that time, the villagers had already been honoring Drogo's memory for more than 400 years. His remains are still associated with the church in Sebourg. Each year, a procession carries his reliquary toward the cross marking the place where the funeral cart refused to continue. Children dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses recall the young man who once watched over flocks in the nearby fields. Over the centuries, Drogo's patronage expanded. He became especially associated with shepherds, farmers, cattle, and other livestock. Because of the affliction that ended his pilgrimages, he was remembered by those suffering from hernias, kidney stones, gallstones, and other painful illnesses. He also became associated with the deaf, those unable to speak, those suffering from mental illness, and those whose physical appearance caused them to be rejected or treated cruelly. Some of these associations have stronger historical roots than others. Like much surrounding Drogo, they accumulated slowly as suffering people found something familiar in his story. And then there is the coffee. By the 19th century, coffee house keepers in the region of Mons had apparently claimed Drogo as their patron. Why they chose a 12th century recluse who had never tasted coffee remains a mystery. Perhaps it was because Drogo reportedly drank only warm water. Perhaps the coffee house keepers remembered his miraculous survival in the fire and thought of coffee beans transformed by roasting without being destroyed. Or perhaps they appreciated the story of a man who could tend sheep and attend mass at the same time. Anyone who has watched a barista take orders, steam milk, pull espresso shots, prepare pastries, and remember which customer requested oat milk in their drink can understand the appeal of a patron reputed to have been in two places at once. Whatever the reason, though, it gave Drogo one final unexpected journey. The man who refused wealth, wandered on pilgrimages, and spent decades behind a wall eventually found his name written on coffee mugs and displayed beside espresso machines. There is something fitting about remembering him over a cup of coffee. Coffee invites us to stop. We may drink it while rushing out the door, driving to work, or attempting several tasks at once. But at its best, a cup of coffee creates a little room within the day. A few quiet minutes in which we can listen, reflect, pray, or simply be present with another person. Drogo's life certainly should not be copied in every detail. His guilt over his mother's death in his early life was misplaced, and some of his penances appear extreme to modern readers. But Drogo's story asks a worthwhile question. What remains of a person when everything familiar is taken away? Drogo lost his parents before he knew them. He surrendered his inheritance. He left his home, relinquished his work, and eventually lost the physical ability to travel. Even the church beside him burned. Yet, when his world narrowed to a single room, his life did not become meaningless. He listened to the people who came to his window. He shared what little food he received. He prayed. He remained faithful to Christ within the life that was still available to him. All of us will encounter limitations. A door will close. A body will weaken. A plan will fail. We may find ourselves living within circumstances much smaller than the life we once imagined. Drogo reminds us that faithfulness to Jesus Christ is not measured by the size of the field in which we serve. Sometimes it looks like crossing a continent, and other times it looks like tending sheep. Sometimes it looks like remaining beside a single window, offering whatever kindness can still pass through it. So the next time you sit down with your weekend cup of coffee, remember the orphan of Epony, the shepherd of Sebourg, the pilgrim on the road, and the saint whose funeral cart refused to leave home. Remember his devotion to our Lord and the innumerable people healed by the power of Christ. Remember Saint Drogo, and wherever God has placed you, remain faithful. Thank you for listening to Fresh Ground Theology's The Weekend Cup. Come back next time and listen as we continue to explore saints and figures from church history.